From Ryan Angelo, are there historical accounts that proves Torah's existence before Sinai? Any literature that you know of?
Okay, so that's a question that is not connected to Genesis 1 necessarily. Okay, as we're going through what it says. That's a question for why are we believing and doing any of this? Okay, that's a much bigger question. That's not the place for it right now. And people can say, oh, that's such a cop-out. No, I've done a teaching on that. The teaching took 2 hours. Okay, right now we're not going to go 2 hours just trying to answer the historical deal with the book. Well, actually, you know what? I'll answer. I'll give you a short answer. You, without any exception, will never, up to this point, where life has been, be able to prove definitively anything in the realm that's not the physical. That's where faith comes in. Oh, there's all kinds of evidence, and there may be archaeological stuff and everything else, but you will never definitively prove that which is invisible, except in your own personal conviction and experience, based on what he says and what you see happen. And so there's tons, and believe me, I am very aware of all of this. I own most of them on my bookshelf, from journeys that I have taken in and out of belief that try to undermine and show that this stuff is a bunch of nonsense or has other sources or other things. And you can certainly read all that stuff and end up where you'll end up, which is where everybody ends up, which is with nothing. And so you have to understand the way, well, first you'd have to decide if you really believe there's a creator of all things, or is this thing that just happens spontaneously from, chemical interaction. And if there's intelligent design and if there's a creator, then you have to ask the question, does the creator who made me, if the answer was yes to the creator, does the creator care what I do? Does the creator have a desire that I do anything? I mean, does it matter? And then if the answer to that is yes, the creator might actually care about what we do, then the next question would be, well, how would we know what to do? He'd have to let us know. And so there's a thought process that takes you through all that. But when you're looking for definitive, well, everybody throughout history has been looking for that. And if they had it, then everybody would believe one thing. We agree? If that existed, we'd all agree to one thing. Which, by the way, when Yeshua shows up, that will settle the argument. I mean, and there will be a lot of people who will be disappointed, excited, surprised, angry, and every other emotion when it ends up being him. Because a lot of people won't like that it's him. They'll have wanted it to be somebody else. Or they won't like that the him is not the way they thought he would be. So there'll be a lot of people excited because it's exactly what they'd hoped. And so, just to be clear, many have started to question down that journey, and I've got the shirt. I've got the street cred. I've got 7 years of it. That's why he allowed me to go down that journey. That rabbit hole, I promise you, leads to, and you can go down the journey. It's nothing, you have to walk out your own salvation. But if you go on that journey, I'm telling you, that journey leads to nothing. And I have to tell you, can we talk? All right? Not amongst yourselves, I'm going to talk. All right. I can tell you, having lived my life for 30, well, let me think, about 20-something years for sure, without Torah at all. I was raised in a Jewish house that kept nothing. So I had no vertical connection, no Torah observance, no thought about the Creator or anything. So it wasn't like I did it just for 5 minutes. It was in my 20s. And I saw what life was like, and I knew what I was like, and I knew what my understanding of what would happen or not happen, any kind of hope I might have had. There was nothing. So I know what that life in that world was like. Then I came into Torah observance and belief in Messiah in mid-20s. And I know what my life was like with the scripture and believing in its validity, and with Messiah, and with the Torah. Because my only experience with Messiah was in a Torah-observant context. Okay? Never went through a Torah-less belief in Messiah. And that's not to my credit, it's just the path he took me through, okay? So then, And this question actually came up today at lunch, so it's interesting that you asked this. Grayson, were you asking that same question just like at lunch? Was it you that typed that in? Okay, never mind. So then when we were leading our ministry back in 2002, 2003, there were people asking these questions. And they were saying, well, what about this verse in the New Testament and that verse that has this issue and that issue? And you know what? Those issues are real. Your book has been handled and manhandled by man. We no longer have the unadulterated perfect word from above. And you know that because there's translations you won't use. Why won't you use them? Because they're bad translations. Why are they bad? Because they're not accurate to this or that. Man has twisted and taken things out and added things in, and you won't use those translations. I don't know which ones you won't use. There are lots of them out there that people say, well, I don't use that one because. So what was the difference between that one and the one you like? The decision that man made to put certain things in or take certain things out or twist certain things a certain way to make a certain point. Well, that's always happened. And there's been an agenda playing out from the beginning. The early church fathers, they wanted to block any thought of being Jewish out of the New Testament. They wanted to disconnect the Torah from the New Testament. They wanted you to have a Torahless Messiah. The Jews, on the other hand, didn't want you to have the Messiah that came 2,000 years ago, so they tried to hide some of those things. And so both your old and your new have been tinkered with quite a little bit. I'm not trying to shock you, scare you, or mess you up. The truth is there and can be found. But you need to know it's a mess. Not a huge mess that you couldn't untangle, but it's a mess. And don't ask me to start pointing them out, because I can point out verses that will mess you up in both books, and you'll be sitting there, really? I didn't even know that was there. And you'll be scratching your head, and next thing you know, you end up with nothing. Now, Abba allowed me when people were asking me these questions, and it all started, I was in South Carolina at a diner after a teaching, and there was a whole bunch of people went out to eat afterwards, and then these questions came up. And I didn't have any answers. I said, let me go look into it. And the deeper I went into that rabbit hole, the more the first thing I did was realize the New Testament was very, very challenging to trust as a source. And look, you can't have anything if you can't trust the source, which is really the question the person's asking. All right? And then I did what a lot of people don't do. I took the old and held it to the same scrutiny. The old had the same problems, different a little bit, but essentially the same types of problems. Now, since I couldn't resolve them at that time, I can resolve most of them now. Couldn't resolve them at that time. I had no choice but because I had integrity, but initially to stop using the new and eventually not use the old and just stop teaching. Because after all, you can't teach with integrity if you don't believe that you have integrity in the source. I think that's something you could all understand. So when people, and actually you can find this when you look me up online, he rejected Messiah back when. I never rejected Messiah. I didn't have a way to defend him. Without the New Testament, it's very hard to defend him. Just like without the Old Testament, it's hard to defend Torah. We don't have the Ten Commandment tablets anywhere, or any of the other things, right? The originals. We don't have originals of anything. So I ended up in that no place for 7 years. So now I had nothing. I know what life was like. I had Torah and Messiah and know what life was like. Then I had nothing again, and I know what that life was like. And then 7 years almost to the day, starting the 8th year, to keep a long story short, my wife, whose mother was passing away, had had a stroke and was in a hospice in a coma not to recover, was very distraught because she said, I used to know what was going to happen and I'd see my mother again and all these things, and now I don't know what I know. Which, by the way, that's what you end up with nothing, is you don't know anything. You have nothing to hope for. You have nothing to look forward to. There's just this awful fleshly thing. And that's all you've got. That's miserable. No wonder everybody's depressed and doing drugs and alcohol and everything else, because there's nothing to look forward to. And if you can't figure out to make this joyful, then that's it. Life sucks and you're going to die. I mean, that's just it. And then on that day, she called me and said all that. I yelled out to Abba, I said, because I've been looking for those answers for 7 years. I was like, enough already. Not like I'm telling him enough already. I was like, can we fix this already so I can help my wife? And that's when he said, let me lead you to a few things, give you a few hints at some answers, and then he said, go get your seat on and get back to work. Okay? So now I'm back with Torah observance and I'm back with Messiah. And I can tell you this to the person, this is a long way of answering that question. I can tell you from my anecdotal experience, my experience, life without, life with, life without, life with. There is no comparison. Okay? And so I'm going to say very definitively, and this is going to go and be taken by everybody wrong. If this whole thing turns out to not be true, it still will have been worth it because it works. It still will have been worth it because life is miserable without it. And you've seen this in your life. Now, I don't believe for a second that it's not true. I'm just saying, for those people that are the doubters and everything else, I'm just giving you at least go this way, at least initially, because of the reasons I'm giving you. You'll see the truth eventually. By living it, you'll get that revelation. But understand, you have a miserable place to be or a place with peace and love and joy and hope and a future. And all those things that happen, that he said would happen when they start happening in your life, like when you see people that really can't even read the simplicity of this book because it takes him revealing it to do that, that to me proves the book better than any archaeological dig. Because there's no rational reason when you go up to your friend and show them what it actually says about the Torah, and they can't, you're speaking Martian to them, even though you said, but I know you're intelligent and you graduated high in your class and you're educated and all this other stuff. How could you not see this? Because he said you can't unless he reveals it. What more proof do you need? Okay, that's where we start to get the proof. Not from some archaeological dig or some other thing, okay? But you can see that in your life. But I can assure you, and some of you have this experience, at least half of it. I had it twice. So I have a much stronger case to make because I had without, with, and without and with. But a lot of you, all of you came from without, and then you came into with. And you should see a very big difference in your life. Okay? And the with and the difference with is exactly how he said it would be. It's not just better in some random way. It's exactly what he said. And so that is where you start to develop your belief and your trust. Now, you also recognize that, yes, there's some things that have been mangled and twisted and other things, but you know what? This is why I give the basic criteria that I gave once upon a time I did a little teaching on this. Some people can say, where's that teaching? Well, it had some things in it and some people in it that are currently attacking me that I'd rather not promote them. Okay? So I'll have to do a new teaching on it. Okay? But I told everybody at that time, for me to feel comfortable with anything that's in the scripture, I want, number one, I want more than one person to say it. I'd like to have 2 to 3 witnesses, please, before I make a doctrinal life decision about whatever my walk is going to be. If it's said one time in one place, I'm not going to throw it out. I may stick it on a shelf if I don't know what to do with it. But for me to feel confident that nobody's messed with the book, it's hard for them to mess with it being everywhere. Because you've got to remember, originally this was in separate individual scrolls. You'd have to go and mess with every one of those scrolls. It wasn't until much later that you have all of it in one big scroll. And even then, it was only the first 5 books was in one scroll. Everything else was separate scrolls. Okay? And so I want to see multiple authors. And don't tell me, well, it's in Corinthians, it's in Galatians. Well, that's one author in 2 different books, 2 different letters. Not the same as what I'm saying. Give me 2 different witnesses. That will really strengthen any point that you want to have. And when everybody's saying it, and there's a lot of things, by the way, that everybody, the prophets and Moshe and the apostles and Messiah, everybody's saying it. Those things you can pretty well stand on like they're rock. Okay? Because they're all saying it. And the second thing is, it has to have a Torah foundation, a Tanakh foundation. It can't just show up new in the New Testament without a foundation in the Tanakh. That's the way the building is built, okay? The house is built on a foundation, not upside down, okay? On the roof with the foundation on the top. See, all of the New Testament Christians out there are trying to make the old fit into the new. No. The new has to fit into the old. It is the only part that's called Scripture. Oh, that's going to get me in all kinds of trouble with you. When Paul is talking to Timothy about Scripture, nothing but the Old Testament existed. When Peter is talking about Scripture and how people twist Paul's writings as well as the other Scriptures, he's only referring to Paul's writings and the Scriptures. The Scriptures is not Paul's writings, not the four Gospels, not anybody else's writings. It's from Genesis to, depends on which book you have, Malachi or 2 Chronicles, depending on the order. All right? It's your Old Testament, your Tanakh. And so it needs to have a Tanakh basis. Do you know how many times the apostles and Yeshua quoted from the Tanakh? It was relentless. Most of what they said was quoting out of the Tanakh, which gives you your second witness. That's part of your witnesses. Yeshua says that you need to love your neighbor as yourself. Guess what? Moses said it too. We're told about the circumcision of the heart. Guess what? We got it in two places, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Actually, got a lot of different people talking about it. And so let's just kind of understand. So this is a good question because people start sitting there and they're reading stuff and they're going, because you have something today. I mentioned this to Grayson at lunch when the question came up. We have something today they didn't have. We have access 24/7 to the Word. We can look at the Hebrew, we can look at the Greek, we can look at commentaries. They had none of this. The literacy in Yeshua's day was single digits. That's how many people could read. Not like everybody could read except like a small percent. No, single digit percent of people that could read. So nobody was reading the Tanakh. They were having it read to them in the synagogues. And the ones who were in the churches were having that's why the priest would have to say everything, and you'd have to believe what he said. Nobody had a copy. They could say anything. You have this available all the time to you on your phone, in hard copy. It's available free everywhere. There's so many free ways to access it, and you can access it all you want, and millions of different versions of it, etc. And so now you get to do something nobody else got to do back then. You get to research, and you can line things up, and you can use concordances to find every place a word shows up, and you can see what it says, and you can line the things up and see if they match, and etc. They couldn't do any of that. And then you end up being too smart for your own good, and you get yourself in a hole because you will actually think your way into trouble. I'm not saying don't think and don't research, just be careful. Because you can do that. This is not something that you get to empirically only. Now, if you're going to believe this is your source, you ought to understand it correctly, which is what I try to teach you. If this scripture is your source. However, it in itself doesn't prove itself. Just because it's there doesn't prove that God gave it. Now, when you read it and things happen and he said it and it happened, and the only way that he could have known it is if he actually wrote it and he knew. Now we have some things that we can point to. And some of you might say, well, he said that so long ago, and then he also tells us after it happened that it happened. How do we know he said it before? Well, how about all the things that you're experiencing in your life that he said would happen in your life, and it's happening, like all the people you talk to that can't understand a word you're saying? I mean, that's the strongest proof of all to me. When he says, I gave them strong delusion, when he says they've inherited lies, when he said that they need eyes to see and ears to hear, and he has to give them to them, and you experience that because some of you are frustrated like crazy talking to your family members or friends, and like, how come they can't see it? Because he said so. Because it doesn't make any sense otherwise. There's no reason why they can't see it, except they can't. And that's really, to me, the strongest proof of anything that's said in this book. And it's a New Testament thing that's said. You don't see that in the Old Testament. Yeshua tells us that's going to happen, and it did. And so that's How do you argue with that? Anyway, so that was my way of answering a question I told you I wouldn't answer. All right. And by the way, for all of you out there, and there's a bunch of you out there, and you may not be watching, I'm going to shame you. And some of you think, that's not right. You shouldn't shame anybody. No, I'm going to shame you. Shame on you if you look at the new, because a lot of people will do this, find some of the problems in it, retreat into the Tanakh and become Jews, instead of realizing the Tanakh has the same problems. I've spoken to a lot of you out there over the last 20 years, where a person came to me, they'll always say to me, oh, but what about this verse? I'm aware of that verse. Well, what about this verse? I'm aware of that verse. I did all the research you can imagine. You have no idea what a researcher I am, okay? I own all the books, all the videos, all the people, and if they were reachable, I spoke to them in person. I know all of the issues that people try to bring up. But then I said, but have some intellectual integrity. If you're going to scrutinize the new in that way, you need to scrutinize the old in the same way. And I asked the person, are you going to do that to the old? They're like, oh no, because the Old Testament is what? No, it has the same types of problems. People with agendas trying to hide something. Okay? The New Testament had early church fathers doing it. The Old Testament has the Masoretes doing it. And so that's where we have our problems. And so just understand that. Shame on you if you don't have the same integrity to look at the old the way you look at the new. If you think the new's got problems, the old's got just as many. They're just a little bit different, but they're just as bad. Bad meaning they're just as challenging. And if you think the New Testament ones are bad enough to give up the New Testament, then you need to give up everything. Of course, I already told you that you'll end up with nothing. And if you end up with nothing, then what are you going to do? And by the way, I don't do this just because it's better than nothing. I do this because he gave me some answers to answer those questions and help me understand what was going on. And so the reason my teachings are so powerful for the ones who think they are is because I speak with full confidence in what I'm saying and full integrity. And that's why you appreciate what I say, because you know I believe it with everything I've got. There are guys out there you see all the time, and you know they don't believe what they're saying. They're just putting out a show, and they're just saying whatever. You know I believe everything I say, which is why when I could not defend it, I stopped teaching it until I could. And hopefully you can appreciate that. So let me encourage all of you. This is absolutely the truth, and it is the only thing that will give you what you want. There's no other way to get there. And you can try. Just know that I told you. This is the way to get there. All right? Okay.